Hello, folks, and welcome to the, I kid you not, 10th episode of TalkiNindies. Um, Something completely improbable, but thank you for people listening and certainly for contributing to make this even possible to begin with. But we'll just get on to the questions. This question is from Esperago, somebody who's asked a few questions before and has been very engaging on YouTube. Always interesting to talk to. So he decided to drop. This one's a bit of a, I don't know. I tried not to research it. I tried not to overthink it because that pulls away from spontaneity and that sort of defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to do here. So this one was a challenge. The questioner, it was more of a request, but he says, I want you to do an exploration of whether or not every genre of game was invented in either the 8-bit or pre-8-bit era of games, and whether or not every game since then has just tried to improve upon these formulas, but fundamentally lacked a new creative core. If there are genres that weren't around at all, because even a single game would count, obviously, then why was it not around? So bear with me. This one, this is like, this is trying to tap into anything I can think of. Like I said, I tried not to research it because that would make it dull and dry and factual, which I don't think facts are necessarily the goal here. It's more of a exercise, and hey, if I miss things or get things wrong, that'll give people plenty of opportunity for giving feedback and for prompting discussion. So yeah, so we'll try to go through this, and I'm doing my best. Okay, so starting with just general action, I broke some of these down into subgenres because there are obvious distinctions with some of these of action is just simply too big, and I didn't break it down much, but I was trying to break these down in some cases because of technology changes in some of these cases, but just some of these things have different flavors and there's things worth acknowledging, and since it didn't specifically talk about consoles, I mean, because when we talk about 8-bit or pre-8-bit, that's more of a console-oriented concept. And the thing is, the arcades, before consoles really started to catch up to the arcades, somewhere around the 16-bit era, you started to finally seeing games that looked a lot more like their arcade counterparts. So, and then you have console, and then you have PC, or what was PC at the time. Before everything was so defined the way it is. But Commodore 64, things like that weren't home console systems. They would have been the equivalent of PCs at that time. So I'll try to pepper all this together because there's just distinguishing console, arcade, etc. becomes complicated because a lot of these obviously originated in the arcade, and they could translate to things like the Atari 2600, certainly in pre-8-bit era, not well. So we'll throw some of these things together with some flavor. So for action, I mean, platformers. There were platformers forever. Easy early examples. Something like Donkey Kong. Certainly the Mario Brothers game, different type of, it's more of an action platformer, but certainly those existed, and those existed on lower end systems. Obviously there were tons of conversions or even clones of Donkey Kong. I played I can't remember the name of it, played a variant on Donkey Kong on the Commodore 64. It wasn't a very good one. But those definitely have been around, and obviously until the Nintendo 64 in that era, you didn't see the 3D platformer. So there was an evolution that happened with that technology in particular. In terms of whether or not I guess things met their potential. with the exception of moving to 3D, I mean, you saw evolutions. Mascot platformers definitely diverted and became more varied in the 16-bit era. Diverting to something like Sonic in one direction with a very different feel. I don't. It's hard to consider Sonic a platformer just because the focus is on speed, but that falls under the banner of action as well. But like, I don't think, other than making like a distinct genre or subgenre out of Sonic-like games, Sonic is sort of in its own space. But I think you saw more variety as you got further along, and people started pushing things in different ways. Because platforming, if you think of Super Mario Brothers and stuff, that sort of was the pinnacle platformer from the 8-bit era. And things existed before that, certainly, but they didn't really come together as well as the Mario. Super Mario Brothers was a phenomenon. It was a whole different thing. Maybe you have things that fall into those categories that were good in their own right. You've got things like Bubble Bobble, platforms. That's an interesting. Bubble Bobble would be sort of a mix of, in a way, a shooter, and there's a strategy. I mean, like, Bubble Bobble's pretty wild. I probably shouldn't have gone with Bubble Bobble. Man, that's trying to put a category on that is a challenge. But let's see. Different flavors, and this is coming from the arcade. Things like Elevator Action. Not quite a platformer in a sense that you don't jump from platforms, but the way the levels work out, to some degree, sort of platformer, and obviously there's shooting. Maybe Elevator Action could have been an early run and gun. Maybe I've gotten ahead of myself. But this is the nature of trying to think of things from history that fall in the same category. But I mean, obviously the concept of a platformer has existed, pretty early on. Definitely 8-bit era. If you count the arcades, it would have been pre-8-bit era because they made adaptations of things like Donkey Kong and things like that for the Atari 2600, and in television. Whether I would count those because they would be so primitive, probably not. I mean, those things were pretty god awful. Definitely the pre-8-bit era with things like the 2600. Things were pretty primitive, and the gameplay was obviously very primitive in many cases, or just awful in a lot of cases too. So then moving on, we have maze games. So something that was inspired by Pac-Man, obviously being the inspiration for that. But you had other games like Lock and Chase, and to some degree, I don't know. I was thinking of Mappy, but Mappy, that's sort of a platformer. Different conceptually type of platformer. But I mean, you had things like Mappy, Lock and Chase. All those came to, pre-8-bit systems even, I think. Or let's see. So the 2600 definitely had Pac-Man. I remember that terrible music and the very strange, disappointing version of Pac-Man that was. But then I remember they made a 2600 version of Miss Pac-Man that was far superior, much like the arcade version of Miss Pac-Man, which is, generally recognized as a great improvement over Pac-Man itself. But yeah, those existed pre 8-bit. Let's see, has there been any evolution of them? I mean, moving to 3D really didn't do anything in particular other than, making... I can't think of anything. I mean, in a way, once you got to a 3D perspective, a maze game would look more like a first-person shooter in a lot of ways. So I can't think of any evolutions that are from that point on. I mean, the nature of a maze game doesn't really change. I mean, you had that recent one, that recent indie game that I played, Maze Blaze. That was very disappointing. But it was at least trying the right thing, trying to combine some shooting with mazes to try to help, I don't know, make things a little bit different and more interesting. But in the case of the controls really let it down because they didn't go with a twin stick control scheme. They said they had a patch, and it almost felt like they were writing to me when they told me about the patch. It said that the control scheme got modified. I haven't returned to it yet. But yeah, if they updated to a twin stick kind of setup, that would be a lot better. So, credit an example of somebody trying to evolve the maze game, trying to add a shooting element to it, which makes sense to a degree. Though you had, depending on what you consider a maze game and having shooting elements. I mean, certainly you had things like Frenzy or Berserk, and those came to 8-bit as well. So yeah, I guess you can't really say that shooting in a maze game hasn't been tried. It's existed, just it's felt very different. Obviously Frenzy and Berserk, pretty primitive. But actually, another one that I can think of. Oh, and this is a game that I wish somebody would make a modern version of. When they do the Atari, when they do the what are they called? The Atari remixes that they've been doing. I can't remember what they make all of them called. Is it Recharged? Yeah, maybe it's Recharged. The game that I really wish they would update would be Major Havoc. Just because that was an interesting hybrid and sort of a maze game. But yeah, vector graphics game, where you'd fly to enemy bases and you'd infiltrate them. You'd have to get through different kinds of, there were like robots that shot out things that would go scooting across, and you really were just having to evade things more so. You could kill things by using your force field. As things would, run into your force field, you could knock them out. But mostly, it was a game focused on you infiltrating, and it was sort of like a maze, and coming in and trying to get in. Let's see, you're trying to get to the reactor to set it off, and then you had to escape before it blew up, and you fly away. And then there was a shooting part that was very interesting, just because it was vector based, so it all felt a bit different. But yeah, and it used a dial for control, so it was very analog. It was definitely a game that was before its time. And that made me think of a twin stick sort of maze-like game early on, which I wouldn't mind seeing adapted also. Cloak and Dagger, which I remember enjoying the movie with Dabney Coleman. But the Cloak and Dagger game I really liked, and that's actually one that when I play emulated stuff on MAME, that would be one of the ones that I would play periodically, just because it was a cool game, very different. But yeah, that is sort of a maze, and it's definitely a shooter. So I was wrong. There were more evolutions, as I think about it, than what I originally gave credit for, depending on what your definition of a maze would be. So moving on to adventure, and this is another pretty broad brush, with point and click adventures. Point and click adventures definitely, and that's more early PCs and stuff like that. Granted, I guess you didn't have a mouse until actual PCs, like the Commodore 64 did not have a mouse, so that wouldn't quite be there, but things in that flavor were there. You just had a more active control. But the concept of the adventure is something where you're going and talking to people and you're on a quest. That one really exists pre 8-bit. If you go down to the base level of things, whether you consider it an adventure or an RPG, we could debate that. But Zork, I guess that's more of an RPG, but it had adventure-ish elements, I guess, too. But yeah, if you boil things down, you've got really early stuff. Because not all things in that era was to work. I mean, you had simulations that were all text-based. Trying to think of a specific adventure that was purely text-based. But, the concept of walking around and picking things up, again, whether or not you call that an RPG or not, it gets tricky. But thinking about point and click then, because that would be more fair. You had in the 8-bit era, you had adaptations of things like Maniac Mansion and things like that, which would be classic point and click adventures. I don't remember if something like you had Day of the Tentacle and Maniac Mansion. I remember on the NES. I don't remember if the Monkey Island games ever made it to NES or not. I don't. In terms of memory, I don't think so. But certainly point and click adventures did exist, and in that era, like I said, the tricky part is the point part. For that to begin, you probably really needed a mouse, and then there was just the console implementation of something like that. And then there's the action adventure, which Zelda is really the game that really made that genre come together. I can't really think of anything action adventure-y predating Zelda that had that kind of feel. The closest thing I can think of you had adventure on the Atari 2600 super early, but obviously that's so primitive that whether or not you say that's a precursor to Zelda would be a stretch. But you're on a quest, and I guess that would just be an early adventure. I talked about point and click adventures. So I guess adventure, so pre 8-bit era on the 2600. It was there at the beginning. You also had some of the Dungeons and Dragons games, which came out more adventure-y on things like the Intellivision. I don't remember there being. There were a couple. I remember I didn't own the Intellivision. My friend had it, and I played quite a bit. I think there was one that was more like an RPG that felt like a one of the dungeon ones where you're going through first person. But I think there was another one that I remember playing that was more adventure-y on a general level. But yeah, so an action adventure sort of perfected with Zelda, really perfected with Link to the Past. That really became the inspiration for so many imitators and people trying to still do that today. You've got roguelikes that have taken that ball and run with it to evolve it, between Sparklight or in terms of a very different flavor. Swords of Ditto has a very different flavor of that model. And it's not. I don't think Swords of Ditto would count as roguelike. No, I don't think so. But Sparklight definitely is. And then you've got even more evolved versions. I'd say Nobody Saves the World. Very much in that action adventure kind of direction and that feel. But so you've seen it evolve, and then certainly you have 3D versions and stuff like that of Ocarina of Time being the big breakout for 3D, obviously, just like Mario was for the platforming genre, and obviously there's been quite a lot of copies. Everybody hated Navi or your little fairy helper. But that was really where the ability to move between your targets with Z targeting. That was her purpose, pretty much, was to provide some help and annoy you. But really, she was there. That was your mechanism for how you'd target different enemies, which obviously was critical and improved combat greatly, where you could focus on somebody, because before that. Without Z targeting, and you still feel it when you have games that don't have some equivalent of that. 3D combat can be pretty damn sloppy, because it's really hard to guide, you can do your attacks and all that, but it's very messy when you don't have something like targeting. Um, so, obviously those 8-bit, and in the case of some, to some degree, adventure did exist pre 8-bit, depending on what you consider adventure and games like that to specifically be. Beat 'em up. So beat 'em up obviously existed. It existed in the arcades, definitely, early on, just because you had things like, obviously something like Double Dragon is the most. That's probably getting the closest to what most people think of as beat 'em ups. It's probably the first of its kind in that flavor, but you had things before that, and it's not Karate Champ. It was a side-scrolling Kung Fu Master, I think, maybe. I'm trying to think of the name of it. But I remember early on, and I remember playing a version of it on the Commodore 64. But certainly in the 8-bit era, you had adaptations of the Double Dragon games. In particular, I played the hell out of Double Dragon 2 for the NES. I loved that. That was just, I don't know, just that I love that specific game. That really worked for me. But trying to think, you had definitely evolution. The evolution definitely would be for the games in the 16-bit era, and at the arcades around, all this becomes sort of a blur. But in the 16-bit era, when you have things like Final Fight coming to the 16-bit consoles, that definitely sort of stepped things up and made everything a bit more exciting, because I think you needed more definition in order to have more variety of attacks and things like that, because Double Dragon obviously kept things pretty basic, but then things like Final Fight in that era, at the home level, started making things more interesting. Though at the arcades, you'd seen there are very different flavors of beat 'em ups in the arcades. You had Double Dragon, but then you had Streets of Rage. You had, there's different flavors. You had Vigilante, which had a very different speed to it. Just very different flavors, and not all those came over. I don't think all those came over to 8-bit, or certainly when they came over to 8-bit, they really didn't adapt well. You really needed the 16-bit systems to be able to handle, the better types of games and to have them feel the right way. Because without the visual definition, those games really lost a few steps. Beat 'em ups are a tricky one. I try to think of anything for casual, because casual is sort of a genre. To some degree, when I think of casual, I think of games that, my parents would play to a degree, like my mother or something might play. So you had things like Breakout would have been, Breakout's a tough one. Breakout's sort of like a puzzle action game to a degree. But I would consider it sort of casual. Like modern casual now with touchscreens, I tend to think of touchscreen games as, there's a lot of casual there. Match threes and things like that. But that's puzzle. But there are more casual games than there are. Casual is just like a threshold where people can enjoy it and it's not as difficult. But you've got like I'd say a game that approaches casual, something like Snake, which most people played on their phone. I remember a game for Intellivision that my friend and I would play a lot called Snafu. That was essentially a Snake game, and there were different modes, and you'd try to bite the other person's snake to cut them off. So it was like a multiplayer version of Snake. But casual, I don't know. I consider it to be in that sort of vein. There's no specific genre. It's just more of a distinction. There weren't too many games that were outright casual. Obviously, if you have if you have an arcade and you want people to pump quarters, things that are more exciting would tend to be things that would draw them in. And I guess people that would play casual games conceptually in a modern way, they wouldn't have gone to arcades, and they probably would feel embarrassed to, because really, video game systems in the early days, there was more of a stigma. They were for kids, or the dad, it was okay to play, but yeah, the mom playing. I don't think of my mother is not a video game person, nor has she ever been. So it's a even the most casual games. I don't think she just plays anything. It's just not her way. So I guess casual really didn't exist. You probably needed something like a touchscreen and the availability of something like a phone. So maybe pre-touchscreens, but maybe just phones, things like phone games. Maybe that's where casual sort of started up, where people had the device already, and there wouldn't be a stigma necessarily around it, to have you sort of playing something. Maybe that's where casual sort of came in. But anyway, so moving on, we have multiplayer. There are a lot of different flavors of multiplayer. Obviously, way back, going back to the very first games, they tended to be multiplayer. You didn't have things like AI. Pong and all of its variants are multiplayer games in the end. In most games I can think of, that I liked from the NES, from the Atari 2600, you had games like Combat and things like that. So you had, the ability to play against your friend directly. Warlords is really cool. So 4-player multiplayer. So you had a pretty cool variety of different games that pushed the limit, even before the 8-bit era ever existed, and some interesting diversity, since those are very different games. Warlords more strategic, so you saw a lot of variety, even before the 8-bit era. And obviously multiplayer games have evolved with obviously the internet. I remember LAN parties for shooters, like we played like Battlefield 1942. We'd have like a LAN party, so be like 8 of us would get together in a big room and play on the same network. Those glorious pre-internet days. So yeah, plenty of stuff existed. Fighting, that was an interesting. Fighting really, to me, there's the pre-Street Fighter 2 version, and then there's post-Street Fighter 2, because before Street Fighter 2 and that era, fighting games were kind of a mess. Really, probably the best one before you got to the Street Fighter 2 era would be Karate Champ, though its control scheme with the 2 joysticks was really, really odd. I never really got into it because it was like I did not find those 2 joysticks appealing, to try to figure out how to get a feel for everything. Karate Champ was probably the best that I can think of before Street Fighter 2, and I believe Karate Champ got adapted to the NES. I know that there were games that were sort of like Karate Champ, but not really. I played, I think it was like International Karate Champion or something like that. That was on the Commodore 64, but it was definitely in that vein. But definitely a very all pre Street Fighter 2. And the thing is, then that puts you have the 8-bit and earlier folks that have fighting in some form, but not necessarily great. But it really took the 16-bit era for Street Fighter 2 to be able to come home. Because Street Fighter 2 was, here's a really crazy admission for a lifelong Nintendo fan, but the first game I got for the Nintendo not the Super Nintendo system. The first system I bought with my own money, not as a gift or anything like that. Bought it partially with I graduated from high school. I bought it with graduation money, but man, I'm old. But the game I bought the Super Nintendo for wasn't Super Mario, that kind of thing. It was for Street Fighter 2, because a friend of mine and I were both addicted. Early days I was a Blanca main, moved to Chun-Li, and now I just enjoy either Ken or Ryu. I just their motion and fluidity, that always had an appeal. I dabbled with E Honda for a bit. Always was a Guile hater. Guile can bite my ass. I do not like Guile. The turtling is just too much. Never was a Zangief. Zangief. And Dhalsim, I probably dabbled Dhalsim, but it just didn't. I don't know. He was too slow moving. It didn't really work for me. But the 16-bit era is definitely when the Street Fighter 2 era of fighting could come home. And obviously there were evolutions in fighting. Depending on what you consider evolution, changing perspective a bit. So you have Tekken and Virtua Fighter, one being sort of quasi 3D, one being more truly 3D. And obviously you could count Mortal Kombat as being an evolution of sorts, certainly on the violent end of things. I'm trying to think of anything that's more modern where fighting really is, because I don't think fighting has really evolved greatly past visually it has, but in terms of core feel, I can't think of anything where fighting has really evolved past, Street Fighter, or having in that era 3D oriented fighting games. You've got stuff like Power Stone, so you have fighting games that are a bit, Smash. Well, yeah, I guess with Smash, Power Stone was on the way there, and Smash sort of took it and ran with it. So I guess Smash is an evolution which didn't show up until the Nintendo 64. So, and really, you're just talking about mixing together, I guess, platforming, fighting game, and more than two players, and then items to spice things up. But that is an evolution. It sort of created its own subgenre. Probably you should consider Smash its own subgenre on its own, because it's definitely its own flavor. So I guess it did evolve, and that did take longer. In terms of now I'm getting back to the original question of was there a reason why it took that long? I don't particularly think so. I guess pre-16-bit era you wouldn't have been able to visually represent any of it well enough. But I would imagine a game like Smash could have worked in the 16-bit era if somebody had conceptualized what they were trying to do. It probably wouldn't look nearly as nice. You'd probably have a lot more repetition, and probably more things like palette swaps and things like that, because the character sprites probably wouldn't have been big enough to get enough detail. So I guess that would have been limited. But I would think technologically there's nothing holding it back. So let's see. So next we have Metroidvania. So Metroidvania, I guess neither Castlevania or Metroid existed until the 8-bit era. So I guess the genre or the subgenre, depending on how you look at it, couldn't have existed until the 8-bit era. Because Metroid and Castlevania obviously are from the 8-bit era. I'm trying to think of if Metroidvanias have really evolved past that. They have in terms of their look and certainly their feel. And you've got first-person Metroidvanias with Metroid Prime, the Metroid Prime series, which is an evolution, sort of filling in the gap somewhere between a first-person shooter and a Metroidvania. So it's more like a guided first-person shooter that has a different feel. But oh, and by the way, I still hold on to the fact that I think Metroid Prime. I think there's a missed opportunity. Um, I think working with the confines of the suit and being alone and being scared, you could really ramp up the suspense. And maybe it would take a modern system to do a better job. But I always thought that when they moved Metroid into being first person, that there should have been an attempt to amp up the horror element, make it more like Alien, where you really feel the suspense of it, and you feel the isolation, and you feel almost the claustrophobia of your own suit, like breathing within the visor, being able to hear your own breath as you get nervous because something's coming, that kind of thing. I always thought that was a missed opportunity, that it just didn't they didn't run with it as much as they probably should have. And I suppose they could have done it to make it more family friendly, but I was always hoping for a Metroid that would really go into that direction. And I guess they did with the side-scrolling Metroid Dread to some degree, so you could always hope that they would incorporate some of those ideas, moving more in that direction with a Metroid Prime 4. We can always hope. But, yeah, so you saw some evolution, but not much. So music. Music is an interesting one, mainly because for the life of me, I couldn't think of anything before something like Parappa the Rapper, which I guess makes some amount of sense since that's a CD-based system. And I'm sure there were probably games before that, but certainly not in the 8-bit era, simply because the processors wouldn't be capable of, I guess, making compelling enough music or good enough music that you could map something to it. 16-bit era with its sound capabilities on those chips probably could have done something that was more of a rhythm game, but again, I can't think of anything. And this is one of those things where I might just have a blind spot and somebody's sitting there listening saying, "Hey, no, you idiot, it's this game." But I can't think of anything that really, before Parappa the Rapper on the PlayStation, I can't really think of anything that really had a music and rhythm feel. I mean, once that got rolling, I loved Donkey Konga on the GameCube. Obviously, that's much later. But yeah, once you got peripherals involved, obviously Guitar Hero had its day and was huge, at least for a little while. And you've got, I'm trying to think of aside from Guitar Hero suddenly the music game genre like shot to the stratosphere. That was one of those tons of people that didn't normally play games that I would have come over. You could get them to play Guitar Hero. So it was an interesting game changer. I guess it was because the music that people were playing along with was the appeal, that it was music that they knew that was, that you're literally playing to the music. So I think that probably was the big determining factor. And obviously, until you got much later on, you wouldn't have either the bandwidth, the capability to reproduce it. You'd be missing. You wouldn't have the storage you needed. So there were a lot of factors that took better technology for something like the music genre to take off. I'm trying to think of post Guitar Hero, whether there's been any evolution. You've got games like Thumper, which is a rhythm game but just has a very different feel to it, but I don't think it really showed an evolution of any kind. So I can't really think of how it's moved even further. But yeah, I would say that the music, for the most part, I think the music genre hit its peak at Guitar Hero, and any of that era. Since then, it's dwindled off. I mean, Fuser was interesting, but I don't think anything is going to get nearly the mainstream excitement that Guitar Hero did. Just it was an anomaly. So moving on to puzzle games. I mean, puzzle games have existed in some form, obviously, since very, very early. It would have been much more primitive, but I mean, you would have had sliding puzzle games, certainly. Minesweeper would be an early puzzle game. And Tetris, obviously, was you could play that on the NES on your Game Boy. And Game Boy, Tetris on Game Boy. That was like the most brilliant game to have paired with a Game Boy as a launch title. I remember playing Tetris against my friend who was, I think if we played, three. I'm trying to think of where we definitely were not evenly matched. He was definitely a bit faster at Tetris than I was. So maybe I would win. I would like to say 1 out of 3, but it's probably more like 1 out of 4. He was really good at it. So yeah, playing Linked against him made me try to get better. But Tetris. Trying to think of any other types of puzzle. I mean, you had hidden object games didn't come along until later, because you would have had limitations in resolution. Because obviously 8-bit era, hidden object would be a laugh. Even 16-bit would be really a challenge to make something like hidden object, because just the resolution you're working at, everything would just immediately stand out. So that's the only version of a puzzle game I can think of that really had to have better technology. So hidden object definitely would have been a later technology, but yeah, early on you had some primitive version of puzzle game that existed, certainly. And certainly box pushers. Thank God, I don't really like box pushers, but I do acknowledge that they're a legitimate full subgenre of puzzle game. So racing, there were actually different distinctions. Top-down racing existed way back. I mean, you would have had in the arcades, you would have had really primitive, to the point of black and white, games with the wheel and all that kind of stuff, but they were top-down. And top-down on probably one of the best games on the NES, RC Pro-Am, amazing game on the NES. So top-down definitely existed. And then I got into first-person racing, and I can't really think of early things like 8-bit systems where I saw that. But it just might be that I played it on Commodore 64, so I didn't bother. I remember. Actually, no, this wouldn't have. Okay, so it wouldn't have been 8-bit. I'm trying to think of when I would have seen the first Need for Speed would have been on our legitimate PC. Would have been when I first saw that. So a first-person racing game where it felt like you were really racing. Yeah, that must have been on our first PC. So much later, and on top-down, another example of top-down racer. Sorry, going back. So pre 8-bit, Turbo on the ColecoVision, if you had the wheel and all that. And then let's see. So Midnight Racing? Midnight Racing? Yeah. So really primitive on the Atari 2600. Even that was almost first person. Actually, thinking about the way you played Midnight Racing, it was really primitive, and you would just see colored pylons essentially, and you're trying to stay within the pylons type of thing. So maybe that is first person, like a really, really super primitive first person racing. But yeah, maybe I've contradicted myself, and it evolved when you had the ability to start sort of rendering the world. I mean, because the original Need for Speed was super primitive, what you'd see, but it really felt like you were driving on the road. It's hard for people to think about that. If they saw a screenshot of it, they're like, my God, how did you think that this was real? But since you'd never seen anything better, it wasn't that it looked real, but at least it was immersive. It's pretty wild. I remember being blown away at the time by things like that. And then after that, then you have chase cam style of racing, which is the way I prefer it. Like, if there's a first person option so I can be in the cockpit, I usually shy away from that really quickly because it's too hard to judge things for me from first person. Chase cam is definitely far superior, and that didn't show up until you had polygon based systems, or at least I can't think of anything. I mean, you could have really primitively done chase cam, but that's really not chase cam. It's more like, it's. Well, oh man, now I'm gonna contradict because you've got things like Outrun, but I don't know if I really consider that a chase cam. Like, because it's a fixed view, and you're not really turning. It's more. Yeah, I don't think it's really a chase cam. So maybe it's sort of like that. Oh man, that's sort of like a first-person racer. It just is. It's showing your car. Like well, it's not first person. I mean, but it's more in that vein. That the road's coming at you. I'm trying to think of how you'd. It's not a chase cam though. Like for me, a chase cam, you need to be in 3D. That you need to be able to feel the turn in a different kind of way than something like Outrun is portraying it. Because Outrun, they're using visual trickery to make things feel like they're turning. In pole position, they made versions of pole position for their primitive systems. Now I'm getting all turned around now that I'm thinking about. I don't think chase cam existed until 3D. I'm gonna. That's my hill. I'm gonna die on that hill. That I consider chase cam needing 3D. But yeah, certainly things. You've got games that push the limit where they were quasi 3D. So they had. I don't know. They had that same feel. I don't think there's an easy resolution. So if you have feedback and you think I'm nuts or completely wrong, let me know. But yeah, it's an interesting thought. So roguelikes, they could have existed. I mean, Rogue, the original Rogue that roguelike is based off of, is a super primitive PC game that I'm pretty positive just used keyboard characters for showing things. So it predated just about anything. But in terms of somebody going with a roguelike, concepts like risk and reward, I think that took it being more the modern era before people would have latched on. Because when I think of like the earliest roguelike games that I remember playing on, that's really on PC, only not in this generation. Obviously, they existed before that. But I don't think of roguelikes. Rogue Legacy being a very early one. I can't think of roguelikes. I think they're in the last decade that they really showed up. I can't think before this last decade of any case of them existing. And I think it just took the gamers changing. Because part of the reason I like roguelikes is because to me they have a very arcade-like sensibility, in a sense that you aren't intended to, it's something that you can beat, but you aren't intended to beat it anytime soon. It's really you're going to play, you're going to die, and you're going to put your quarter in and start over again. Now, I got into last week roguelike versus roguelite, with meta progression and things like that. So in that sense, it deviates from the arcade, and risk and reward is obviously a concept that didn't have to exist in the arcade. But I like the fact that roguelikes aren't intended to be long form games. they're generally, I mean, I've played ones where a run to completion can take like an hour and a half. But, a typical roguelike run, maybe a half hour if I'm lucky, depending on the difficulty and, which one it is and that kind of thing. But I think it was as a parent with kids where I couldn't play long-form games. Roguelikes really scratched the itch because they were challenging and I could get into them, and you had meta progression that you felt like you were moving in a direction. But the runs were short enough that I could do it as a fill-in game where, I was minimizing my chances of getting interrupted, and I could, even if I got interrupted, I could probably just pause it type of thing. And it wasn't one where I felt like if I stopped playing it for, a few days, I lost track of where I was, or, that was always RPGs and big, large scale adventures with kids were always a mess, and miserable, because if I stepped away for more than a few days and came back, I would lose track of where I was, So, roguelikes really, I think, are like great parent games, because of the fact that they're short and things like that. RPG, I already mentioned Zork. Zork was obviously, the first kind of RPG, text-based completely, so existed super, super early. And in terms of evolution, I think it's really only been visual. I think RPGs are probably one of the most, they're one of the most dialed in. They were dialed in to begin with, and they already did their thing, and they didn't need to change. They obviously visually, and you have tactical RPGs versus just more traditional JRPGs, and you've got Western RPGs, and you've got obviously now you've got first person open world RPGs. I mean, those are all evolutions, but the essence of the RPG experience has never changed. It's only ever been built on. I don't think anything's ever really deviated. Not really in a way that some of these other ones broke off. I mean, you do have subgenres with JRPGs versus Western RPGs and stuff, but man, that core, it's so fundamental that, I mean, something where you're managing your inventory and things like that. I mean, you're now an RPG, and I don't think there's any way to get away from that. But yeah, definitely existed previously. Then we have shooters, traditional vertical scrolling versus side scrolling. I mean, those did exist. 8-bit era, they would have been really challenged. I mean, you do have pre-8-bit era even shooters of certain types. Like you did have Asteroids, and you could play things like Vanguard. I remember playing on the Atari 5200. I mean, so pre-8-bit era, but definitely there was more of a struggle. Like until you had the 16-bit era and the level of detail, shooters really struggled. They were playable, but boy, they weren't what they needed to be. But then you have, I don't know. I mean, I guess in the 8-bit era, you had some conversions that were better. I remember playing the name. Cannot think of the bio. Now my brain's blanking out on that. I think the 8-bit era you started seeing better shooters, but I don't think until the 16-bit that I was really, I think really for vertically and horizontally scrolling shooters that they really weren't done proper justice until the 16-bit era, because they were coming from the arcades. I can't think of. It's just you really needed to get to the 16-bit era, because before that they were there, and I mean you could play them. Like I said, I was playing traditional arcade style shooters back to, well, they had ones. Obviously Space Invaders was on 2600, and that was one of the huge, biggest games for the 2600. And you had, even games like Centipede and things like that. But they were all representations. They didn't really honor shooters, I think there's a visual aspect to traditional arcade shooters that, and yeah, if you go primitive and Galaxian and things like that, it isn't all that much to represent. But when I think of most really great arcade shooters, there's a visual component to them that's really, really important, even beyond just the way the game plays. There is a visual component that's very satisfying that I don't think you could have seen until the 16-bit era, fully. That it would be there. I don't know. It just wasn't. It wouldn't be the same. So I'm gonna put my foot down and say that really for a traditional shooter, arcade shooter, I'd say the 16-bit era is really where it finally came together. Because I don't know. I don't think of pre things. I don't know. It's just, to me, it didn't feel the same. Now, in one that worked perfectly well in the 8-bit era, obviously, the run and gun with Contra. I mean, Contra, everybody played Contra. And that's why the Konami code, everybody remembers it, because, boy, if you didn't have the Konami code to get all those extra lives, Contra was damn hard and didn't really work. So let's see. So run and gun, twin stick shooters. I mean, that's trickier. I think 16-bit era, you would have had mappings because you had 4 buttons. You would have had mappings that would have approximated twin stick. I don't know how well. I'm trying to think of. I mean, until you had actual dual analog sticks, twin stick shooters really wouldn't be. You really wouldn't adapt them properly and do them justice. So I would think that you need to wait until. Let's see. I mean, the Nintendo 64 really wouldn't have been able to even do it. I can't imagine using the camera little nub for a second stick. So I don't imagine twin stick really got going until later. I mean, obviously in the arcades, twin sticks. I mean, Robotron 2084 is one of the best arcade games ever made. But yeah, it didn't. Coming home, you would have had problems because keyboard wouldn't have worked on PC. I mean, you could have 2 joysticks, but I don't think they'd count on somebody sitting there with 2 separate joysticks. The way the joysticks were back then, if you actually tried to play a twin stick, you could have 2 joysticks, but if you tried to play a twin stick shooter, it wouldn't have worked because all the joysticks and stuff were designed to be held. So there wouldn't have been a way. You could have put them on your lap, or I guess if you built a base that you could lock them into so they'd stay stable, you could have played a twin stick shooter way back when. But it would have been problematic because nobody made a controller with 2 joysticks, not on the same thing that was easy to hold, or that would have made it possible. So yeah, I think that, and so that would have been a hardware limitation because nobody made that configuration. It wasn't until the post, like somewhere around the GameCube era where dual analog sticks became the norm. That would have been where you would have seen it be possible to you certainly could have the game, but it wouldn't be done justice until you were able to do that. And then first person, I'm trying to think of. I think it was the Super Nintendo was the first one to have Return to Wolfenstein, or Wolfenstein 3D, or I guess it was Wolfenstein 3D. I don't recall anything. An 8-bit would have been too primitive to represent anything, aside from the fact that I don't think first-person shooters. I'm trying to think of the timing of Doom in relation to what console generation. But yeah, 16-bit would have been where that would have showed up, and mainly it's just a visual clarity kind of thing that I'm trying to think of what a 8-bit first-person shooter would look like, and it would just look like hot garbage. It just wouldn't have the clarity that you'd want or need. And people weren't ready for it, I don't think. I mean, people weren't ready for Doom when the Doom came out. but certainly first-person shooters were very popular and successful even before the 3D era, even though 3D definitely expanded things. But until GoldenEye sort of brought the console side up, I don't think that first-person shooters really had traction on the console side of things. It was definitely more of a PC thing with mouse and keyboard. I don't know, like WSAD for life is definitely words to live by for first-person shooter fans, because you're playing on PC, because mouse and keyboard just, console controller is just not going to live up. I thought it was funny seeing. I think it was for, I guess it was Overwatch 2, that if people were playing multi-platform on console with PC players, that it disables the auto aim, which it should, because auto aim's sort of cheap, but it's really something you need on the console side, to have some assist, or not auto aim, sorry, aim assist, or whatever they want to call it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of precision, if you were just nothing on the software side is trying to compensate, you could be the best console shooter person. If you're playing even probably the top 20% of first-person shooters from PC, you're going to get rocked, because it's so much easier to get the precision that you want. With the stick, it's only precise to a degree. Like, it is playable, but I have a terrible time trying to play first-person shooters on console with a console controller. It drives me nuts. And actually, if I had to play with an actual mouse, it would drive me nuts on the PC side too. I've been using a trackball for years. The Logitech trackball rocks. Using your fingers. If I had to use a thumb trackball, I'd hate it. But yeah, using your index and middle finger for control, so nice and precise and so easy. But anyway, so simulations existed back in even the text-based days. Those certainly predate just about anything. Just because the concept of simulating something, it works fine with text-based. That I'm walking you through a scenario, so it's technically a simulation. Then sports games obviously existed since the beginning of everything. Pong was the original. Against Space War Arena, or whatever the original arcade game. Pong was Pong, and it is tennis. It's just the most primitive version of tennis ever, or ping pong, depending on how you want to look at it. So sports definitely existed, and evolution-wise, I mean, obviously it's all been related to visuals. I can't think of anything that, aside from visuals, sports, as the technology improved, I mean, obviously you could look at something like Madden and its evolution over the years, but it's all to do with visual fidelity. I don't think, and the gameplay evolved as the visual fidelity improved, and the systems were more capable. But I mean, fundamentally, playing Tecmo Bowl is just a primitive version of Madden, which is a primitive version of modern Madden, and that sort of thing. I don't think that the technology really changed the fundamentals. It just made it possible to represent more and more accurately. But I mean, I don't know. I guess it depends a bit. Football feels like it's evolved more, but like baseball doesn't feel like it's evolved nearly as much. But I guess the game was simpler to begin with. Same with soccer. Probably hasn't evolved greatly. Football has definitely seen the biggest jump, just because the nature of the way football is played. Be able to look downfield versus being able to, looking at it sideways. That's a pretty big difference. But yeah, sports has been around. And the last one I had was survival. And survival games, I think it would be a matter of where you define how far you go with defining survival, because survival to me feels a lot like roguelikes, in a sense that I think that it had nothing to do with technology so much as I think it took there being a taste for something that's more challenging and that pushes you in that specific direction. I think you could have made you had survival. I guess if you consider Oregon Trail a survival game, I mean, you allocated resources and stuff like that. It's not quite the same. You don't have crafting, but you're certainly trying to survive. So maybe we're making a distinction then. So like, if you make a modern survival game where you expect there to be a focus on crafting and collecting resources, perhaps having to eat or drink, I mean, depending on how that works, but crafting is really a fundamental part of a modern survival game. And you didn't really have that so much back then. I'll say it's a half and half. Modern survival didn't exist, but I think that's more, like I said, a sensibility. I think it would have been too niche for people to pursue further back. You were making games for mainstream because you wanted to sell as many copies as possible to a much smaller overall audience. I mean, now that the gaming audience is so big, you can make good money developing purely niche games. There's entire companies that they only make niche games, and they make good money because they know their audience and they give them what they want, which leads to some really frightening kinds of games on the PC side, in particular in Steam. Just the evolution of adult games is even just seeing the periphery is terrifying. But obviously by the number that show up on a weekly basis, if you just look at what's selling most recently, having something come up as adult or having sexual situations, it's terrifying how prevalent games that sell well. But I guess on such a large platform like Steam, it's easier for things like that to show up and to become popular. Consoles, that would be more of a surprise. But yeah, survival. Yeah, I think survival took the audience existing before you could make survival games really viable. You might have had games that had survival elements, but in terms of pure survival game, I think that's more of a modern thing. And I did forget strategy. Feel bad for that. So strategy, you've got turn-based and you've got real-time. Real-time was a PC thing, coming from the Command and Conquer and things like that, Warcraft, and those didn't exist until far later. That's definitely post 8. I don't even think 8-bit you could have strategy, but real-time strategy, I think you would have had processing complications even attempting it. Your AI wouldn't have been nearly what it would have to be. So, real-time could not have existed. Just based on the processor, it couldn't have handled that many, because real-time strategy, you're counting on a certain amount of units, and you're really counting on some sort of AI because of the number of units, because you can't explicitly control them all. I think that's far past the 8-bit era. But in terms of basic strategy, XCOM was earlier PC. I'm trying to think of a strategy game on the console side, or would have qualified as a strategy game on the console side. Because everything I think of is a PC oriented thing. So Civilization, which I guess, well, no, in terms of but SimCity would be a simulation. Civilization, did Civilization come to? I don't think even primitive versions of Civilization came to the NES. So sorry about people who like simulations that I left out. The Maxis phase. And Maxis was huge with all their Sims, all the different Sim games. in SimCity going back to the early, the NES days. But strategy, for the life of me, I cannot think of a strategy game that would have been on an 8-bit system. And I'm not sure. I think visual clarity would have played a part. Just because I think if you were as primitive, you could represent chess on early games. It was a variant on chess that would have been 8-bit era. Arkanoid. Arkanoid was, I don't remember if Arkanoid came to I played Arkanoid on the Commodore 64. I don't know if Arkanoid ever came to. So I guess in that sense, the fact that you could represent chess could represent a strategy game on a basic level. And then you have, like I said, Arkanoid, you have chess with value add because you had movement like chess, but then it wasn't automatic, that somebody took the other piece. When the two units met, you'd have a fight. And then the way they compensated was the pawns I think the pawns were completely melee. So you had to be right up on somebody, and then depending on what unit you had on your side, you were more powerful and had different types of powers, which was a really cool, a cool way to enhance chess, so that would have been capable of running on the 8-bit. So I guess in that sense, strategy could have existed. I don't think something like XCOM. I think XCOM would have taken a certain level of sophistication on the part of the players and visual clarity where you couldn't have seen that. I don't think you could have seen that in the 8-bit era. I don't think it would have cut it, and I don't think the players would have been ready for it either at that time. But anyway, so I knew this was going to be a Herculean discussion. Hopefully it worked for people and stayed enough on task that it wasn't a complete bore or excruciating. But yeah, definitely a lot of game names and a lot of history randomly thrown around, Nintendo and otherwise. But it was a fascinating question and interesting to walk through. Thanks to Esprago for sending that along. It definitely was. It was one that I waited an extra week to even attempt to tackle, just because even not preparing for it, it's one of those things that if I know the question's there, in the back of my head subconsciously, I'm putting together notes, not actively, but just so I wouldn't feel like I was completely spitballing. I mean, I came up with things as I went and lost my place a few times, even as it was, having given at least some minimal thought. But so that brings us to the end. Hopefully somebody has some questions, because I think we're down to a critical level. I think we might only have like one question left in the hopper. So if you want to have this continue, be sure to send them in to justin@nindiespotlight.com. And I guess that's it. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Getting us to double digits, as improbable as that was. We'll see if it can survive any longer, depending on if we get some questions. But it's been an interesting one. Thank you for listening. This has been Justination for Nindie Spotlight, and I'll talk to you guys next time.